Okay, it's twofold in a way, Jim. What happened was, as soon as that young maths student, and I've got to say, everyone that sat down there was on the day totally dressed. There was no one that looked like they needed a shower or anything. As soon as he sat down, within 30 seconds, and we were across the road from the Wellington train station, just to give people a picture, and in front of the main IRD building of New Zealand with the beehive in the sights, a burly, dare I say, because I'm burly myself, businessman walked past in full suit and a couple of mates either side, spied him and yelled out, "Get a job!" Now, I've got to say, I think the sign is a distraction. Now, that young man replaced that sign then with one that said, "Would you help me?" ? I'll pass it on, and a smiley face. And nothing changed for him. The people looked away still and kept moving on.
Good on you, Donna, and everyone else that you've recruited, Bernie, and thank you very much for joining us today on the panel.
Thanks, Jim.
Bernie Harfleet, give a kid a blanket. What else can I ask you about? The stoush between Helen Clark and Ray Avery. So Ray wants to hold this big Live Aid type concert next year at Eden Park to raise money for his baby pods. Helen Clark says no one knows how noisy that'll be. It's the thin end of a wedge to make Eden Park a concert venue against the wishes of people in Sandringham and Mount Eden. Whose side are you on here? It looks likely, I think, to go to the Environment Court. Whose side are you on here?
It's a bold call to take on a charity trying to raise money for neonate units, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I'm not on either side, really. I think that a public stoush between two strong-minded, high-profile people is always very untidy, and I think both actually are sort of guilty of engaging in sort of verbal bullying, and they need to behave better.
He says
deal with it through the normal channels.
Well, he says the concert won't be loud. She calls him bullying. I think his remark about the petty politics perhaps is debatable because there are a lot of residents around who just don't like the noise. But he says she should have done what we're good at in New Zealand and pick up the phone. What use do you suppose her picking up the phone would have been, though? That's an interesting remark from Sir Ray. Do you think that would have worked?
It's a high horse you can get on after the fact, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think that there are rules that the concerts operate to. I think Helen Clark said there was another venue that would be better. Sorry, I'm not an Aucklander, so I don't know these things. But, you know, you can't, even for a really good cause, it's hard to move against the rules. And does that then set a precedent that mean other concerts will happen at that venue if they're not approved? I don't know. But those things all need to be taken into consideration.
It's like your man with the pub down south, isn't it? Like if so long as they stick within the rules, then they can do what they want to do. And if they breach the rules, then there are consequences. And so if it is too noisy, it's too noisy. But if it's not, if it's just neighbours of a stadium complaining about noise, then you kind of know what you're getting when you're next to a stadium.
That's been a long argument in Auckland for many years, especially around, well, Eden Park, but also Western Springs, that if you buy a house near Western Springs, you know what you're getting into. But it's also quite a complex argument in the sense that people don't always, do they? With the best will of the world, they don't know how loud things are going to be or how much disruption.
Her government also declined to build a stadium in Auckland CBD, so...
Very good to talk to both of you today. David Cormack, thank you for your company.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Heather.
Heather Roy, thank you for yours, and good luck at the family reunion this weekend.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Have a lovely weekend yourself, and we are back with the panel on Monday, and here's Checkpoint.
Tō mai rai, hoa mā he kōrero, kei te haere he kaupapa kei te karawhiua. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're crossing to Thailand, where tragedy has struck. An operation to save 12 boys and their coach trapped in a flooded cave. Why China is mentioned 31 times in New Zealand's latest defence policy statement. The trade war is now officially underway. It began about 58 minutes ago, but the question is where to next? Also tonight, we are looking at, well, the Football World Cup. It's the quarterfinals weekend. Clay Wilson and I try and pick the winners. A fat chance, but it's fun giving it a go. And, well, we're going to talk to people about what's happening with Donald Trump and China, and a wooden structure being built by a person with high dreams.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora, good afternoon. Ko Katrina Batten aho. The Mayor of Auckland, Phil Goff, has pulled the plug on a public talk by two Canadians accused of encouraging hate speech. Mr Goff has banned the controversial Canadian pair from using the Bruce Mason Centre next month. Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux are best known for their alternative right-wing views on a range of issues, including feminism, gender and immigration and Islam. Phil Goff announced this afternoon the two cannot use the Bruce Mason Centre as planned and are not welcome in any other council-run venues.
I see no obligation at all to provide a venue for people who are coming from outside of our country to a city that embraces diversity so that those people can stir up racial or faith hatred.
Phil Goff says the decision has been made for security reasons. Tragedy has struck the rescue operation to free 12 boys and their football coach from the flooded cave network in northern Thailand. One of the divers has died while delivering supplies to the group. The BBC's Jonathan Head is outside the Tham Luang cave.
The first person to die during this operation was a former Navy diver who'd volunteered to support the effort to rescue the boys. The authorities say Petty Officer Saman Gunan was making the difficult 5-hour journey back from supplying the cave where the boys and their coach have been trapped for the past 2 weeks when he became unconscious and could not be revived. The Navy says its divers will continue their mission. Today they will try to take a communication line and a pipe carrying oxygen into the cave where the oxygen levels have dropped.
Jonathan Head in northern Thailand. Local fashion designers have been left out of pocket in the wake of the closure of one of New Zealand's largest fabric wholesalers. Cooper Watkinson Textiles announced it would be closing its doors a few months ago, but many were expecting orders from them that never arrived. Wellington designer Desiree Turner says months of work for a collection was essentially useless.
I already had orders in, so I couldn't actually redesign anything because it was too late. The lookbooks had already been done, myself and the sales agent had already been out and taken orders, so the only thing that I could do was try and find an alternative fabric.
Desiree Turner says deals with half her retailers had to be either cancelled or renegotiated, and her business has suffered financially. Wellington's first Matariki fireworks festival has been postponed as a southern right whale shows no sign of leaving. It's been in the harbour since Tuesday. Mariana Johnson has the latest on the capital's visitor.
Wellington has been abuzz this week with the arrival of a southern right whale in the harbour. The huge mammal has been frolicking in the harbour for the last few days, with excited locals clamouring to get a glimpse. Wellington City Council has decided to postpone the Matariki Sky Show scheduled for Saturday to avoid disturbing the whale. The acting mayor, Jill Day, says the Department of Conservation's advice was that the noise was unlikely to harm the whale, but it could act unpredictably, affecting boats or kayakers in the area. An inter-islander ferry had to delay docking today after the whale was spotted in front of the terminal. The fireworks have been postponed until July the 14th. Ko Mariana Johnson tēnei.
A high-profile Christchurch chef has been sentenced to 6 months home detention for not passing on his employees' tax deductions. Johnny Swass was named Cuisine Magazine's Restaurant Personality of the Year in 2011 and has owned a number of Christchurch restaurants over a long career. Today he was sentenced to home detention and ordered to pay $130,000 in reparations over his failure to pay $250,000 in tax, child support, student loan and KiwiSaver deductions for his staff. Inland Revenue says he used the money as a free loan to pay creditors in order to continue trading. Schwass was recently awarded the contract to operate the City Council-owned Ilex restaurant in the Botanic Gardens. It's 4 minutes past 5. To sport, employment lawyer Philippa Muir will lead an independent investigation into the conduct and culture at New Zealand football. The national body this afternoon confirmed details of the review, which comes after 13 members of the national women's squad made official complaints about the team environment under head coach Andreas Heref. The investigation was originally set to focus solely on the culture within the football ferns, but New Zealand Football President Derek Shaw says broadening the scope of the review was necessary to improve the future of football in this country. Winning another Super Rugby title is the main thing on Crusaders prop Wyatt Crockett's mind. The 35-year-old 71-test veteran will play a record 200th game for the Crusaders in tonight's home game against the Highlanders. While proud to have achieved the mark, he has his eye on a much bigger prize.
I'd love to win another title, but there's a fair bit to go between now and then. I think we've just got to continue to keep playing well as a team. But yeah, I'd love to sign off with a title. That'd be pretty amazing. But as I say, it's a tough journey to get there. But we've given ourselves a chance now. So,
Wyatt Crockett. Tonight's game kicks off at 7:35. The Warriors are at full strength and go into tonight's NRL game at Penrith as favourites. The Panthers are 4th on the table and the Warriors 5th. However, the home side will be without 3 State of Origin players, including star halfback Nathan Cleary. And the Uruguay forward Edison Cavani remains in doubt for their World Cup semi-final against France tomorrow morning. Cavani limped out of their last 16 win over Portugal with a calf injury and is fighting to be fit in time. That's the news.
Tonight on Nights we begin a new series of live concerts captured by our audio wizard, or one of them, Andre Upston. You might even speak to the man himself. Our Something for the Weekend involves a pyjama party at the Otago Museum, which will go nicely with a sonic tonic dedicated to night attire.
Dame Margaret Baisley's report on law firm Russell McVeigh has cast a light on the entire legal profession.
A lot of what we do, especially in litigation, for example, is tough confrontational adversarial stuff. You have to be a tough nut. But that shouldn't translate into your working environment being harsh, unsupportive, unhealthy, toxic. And those two things should not go hand in hand.
The news as it happens on Lately with Karen Hay, 10 p.m. weeknights on RNZ National.
Met Service weather through to midnight tomorrow. Severe weather warnings and watches are in place for parts of southern and central New Zealand. Western and central areas from Northland to Manawatu, excluding Taranaki. Mainly fine, cloud increasing tomorrow with drizzle patches, then rain south of Waitomo later. Taranaki and Horowhenua through to Wellington, cloudy areas with patchy drizzle. Rain tomorrow, heavy about the ranges, northwest gales in Wellington tomorrow. Gisborne to Wairarapa, mainly fine, however tomorrow in Wairarapa, rain and gale northwesterlies developing. For Nelson, fine today, rain tomorrow, heavy at times. Bulla to Fiordland, drizzle patches but heavy rain south of the glaciers, spreading north tomorrow, then easing. Northwest gales in Fiordland for a time. Marlborough, Canterbury, Otago and Southland, high cloud with patchy rain south of Ashburton today. Rain spreading elsewhere for a time tomorrow with heavy falls near the Divide. Northwest gales in places for a time. And the Chatham Islands cloudy periods. It's 8 minutes past 5 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thanks, Katrina, and thank you everyone for being with us. We begin tonight in the Thai caves where 12 schoolboys and their football coach are waiting to be rescued. This afternoon, news that one of the men trying to rescue them has died. A former Thai Navy SEAL who was part of a highly experienced dive team placing oxygen tanks along the route out. All week we've been hearing from people who've been in the caves that rescuing the boys will involve overcoming extraordinary odds. No one believed there would be such a terrible demonstration of that before the boys had even left their shelter point. And a short time ago, the question on everyone's lips was asked by a journalist to the commander of the Navy SEALs.
If it is so dangerous that a former SEAL died in the cave, does that not mean it is too dangerous to bring children through?
Yes.
So does
but we try everything for the best way to help them.
CNN's Dave McKenzie is at the cave site and I spoke to him shortly before we came on air.
The tragedy happened in the early hours of this morning, Thailand time. Samran Kunan, mid-30s, former Navy SEAL diver. You know, John, he left private practice. He had resigned from the Navy. He came back to be of service of his country, bring his special skills to this extraordinary rescue attempt. And he was taking oxygen tanks into the cave system because the oxygen levels are depleting rapidly, both where the rescue divers have their underground staging point and also where the boys are further down the cave system. So there's a real sense of loss and resolve here this morning in Thailand. And I'm looking at those oxygen tanks now that they took in. They're about 1.5 meters high, big cumbersome tanks that have to negotiate through these narrow passageways. And this man did his best, but it really does show how challenging it is, even for professionals and former professionals, to do this work to try get these boys out.
And also there is no margin for error in parts of these caves, right? Some of it is the water is moving very, very fast. The water is very muddy and there is no visibility. The space between the floor and the ceiling is very, very narrow. There is so much that can go wrong. And this guy was working with a buddy, right? He wasn't alone.
Well, they are working with buddies, and it does seem like he had an issue with his air. Either he ran out of air, but what is clear is that he passed out while making that dive. Any of your listeners who've been diving before recreationally know that even in not great conditions, it can be difficult. Now, consider this, that as you say, it's a moving current, no visibility. You're working with a guideline under the ground, and most importantly, and I spoke to a specialist cave diver just hours ago, he said is the fear factor. You are covered by a roof over your head at all times. There's no escape route. You have to just deal with it, and psychologically it's incredibly difficult. Now, again, for these young boys to undertake this kind of extreme diving situation with no training, it's hard to kind of imagine at this point how they're going to pull it off, but they are certainly trying.
Oh, I see the admiral at the scene. He may be an admiral. He says that they won't let this man's life be in vain. We will carry on, he says. What is the mood from the families now? Because there was such euphoria when the boys and their coach were discovered. But how are they feeling now?
I'm sure it's a terrible reality check again for them of how challenging this is, because, there was euphoria when the boys and their coach were found. We spoke to several extended family members, teachers and others who've set up small shrines. One counsellor making the young students build or make origami birds because she said it represents freedom. So this whole community is pulling together. But I think this moment is a dark moment in this rescue operation. Perhaps it will have a happy ending, but certainly the parents who've been kept away from the media, understandably, are going to be feeling extremely distressed today if they weren't already.
David McKenzie, who is CNN's correspondent at the caves. It's 12.5 minutes past 5. We turn now to the Strategic Defence Policy Statement that was released today. And the way the government has highlighted concerns about China in its long-term strategy for defence has surprised some New Zealand academics who warn China won't be pleased. The strategy includes moves in new areas, namely climate change, cybersecurity and outer space, as well as ramping up concern about some of the actions of countries larger and much more powerful than ours. Big regional power plays at stake here. Political reporter Gia Garrick explains.
Littered throughout the latest defence policy statement are concerns about international powers, namely the increasingly inward-looking United States, North Korea's growing nuclear and missile arsenals, and also, for the first time, a solid stance on our major trading partner China. The concern is the nation's increasing confidence and how it's planning to utilise that. One example our government's not happy with is its move to militarise the islands in the South China Sea. Defence Minister Ron Mark says this is the coalition government being completely transparent in its views.
They are friends and people that we wish to have better relationships with. But there are some things that are not conducive to peace and stability that raise opportunity for miscalculations that are unhelpful. So these matters are highlighted.
He delivered a speech today to an audience of academics, foreign diplomats and military personnel.
I think the document's pretty clear. I think actually we haven't been shy to state what we see.
Some were surprised to see such a bold stance on the matter. Victoria University's Professor of Strategic Studies, Robert Asen, is one.
Very clearly from the document you can see that on the whole the New Zealand government is concerned that China is seeking to change aspects of what it calls the rules-based order in parts of the Asia-Pacific. So I think China will find that this is a difficult one to swallow.
His colleague, David Karpi, agreed.
I don't think China's going to like us talking about the South China Sea. I don't think China's going to like the way it's characterised in the policy statement. But I think A lot of what it actually says is a kind of chronicling of facts that have happened. Islands have been built, bombers have landed on them, radar stations have been built, and so on. And those are facts that nobody really disagrees with. But China's not going to like this.
National's Defence spokesperson Mark Mitchell is urging caution, saying this government needs to be very clear on its plan and its position on China.
New Zealand has got long-standing relationships with China in lots of different areas, economic interests and trade interests that are pretty important to us.
But Mr Mark doesn't share the sentiment that China will be disappointed with the government's stance and says he's personally made sure of that.
There's nothing new to China. I've had this very discussion directly on a one-on-one bilateral conversation with their representative in Singapore at the Shangri-La Dialogue. There's nothing in here that we haven't discussed.
Mr Mark is confident the military will be well equipped for the future and will be reassessing the $20 billion military spending plans of the previous government. He's keen to see procurement of equipment that will mean New Zealand is ready on the front lines should we be called upon to fight.
We need to accept, and this government does, that when we equip our military, it is because primarily their first principle is that they are a combat force. They need to be combat capable. They need to have professional personnel, well-trained, well-resourced.
Climate change is also a major focus, which Mr Mitchell is pleased to see.
It's consistent with when we're in government in terms of continuing to make investment into equipment that is going to support our defence forces and being able to respond to climate change. So I think that's positive.
The strategy also points to a better utilisation of outer space in terms of defence communications and a big focus on cybersecurity and its uses as an offensive tool as well as a defensive one. With the release of the government's defence strategy out of the way, Ron Mark can now focus on the part he's looking forward to most, procurement. And he's pleased that despite his years of criticism at cost blowouts and shoddy decision-making, he now has a glowing report by Sir Brian Roche to prove to Cabinet his decisions will be sound. From Parliament for Checkpoint, Gia Garrick.
Auckland's mayor has banned a controversial Canadian pair from using the Bruce Mason Centre next month to give a public talk. Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux are best known for for their alternative right-wing views on a range of issues, including feminism, gender, immigration and Islam. Phil Goff announced this afternoon they would not be welcome in any council-run venues. The event organiser says the decision is a disappointing blow for democracy. Emma Hatton reports.
Lauren Southern, a journalist, activist and filmmaker, along with the Frito-Main radio podcast head Stefan Molyneux, had planned to speak in Auckland on August 3rd. Just hours ago, Auckland's Mayor Phil Goff announced no council venues would be made available for them. Event organiser David Pallow says he's disappointed.
It's a great surprise that a registered terrorist organisation like Antifa would be able to be so effective in shutting down civil conversation in a democratic liberal country like New Zealand.
Auckland Mayor Phil Goff says he has no dealings with the group Antifa, an anti-fascist far-left group, and the decision not to allow the pair at council venues was for security reasons.
The nature of the inflammatory speech that these people engage in would create security concerns. I see no obligation at all to provide a venue for people who are coming from outside of our country to a city that embraces diversity so that those people can stir up racial or faith hatred.
But David Pallow says Phil Goff has got the wrong idea about what the pair want to talk about.
He's misrepresented the purpose of the events as to stir up ethnic and religious tensions. He's misrepresented them as views that divide rather than unite.
Human rights criminal law barrister Craig Tuck says the pair should be allowed to come to New Zealand and talk about their ideas.
However hateful they may be, and horrible they may be, and disingenuous they may be, but the reality is they should be allowed to speak about them, and the public should be able to engage those ideas and develop their thinking.
He says there's a difference between dangerous words and dangerous people.
They're not specifically designed, or one would assume, they're not trying to come to New Zealand to commit crimes. They're coming to New Zealand to spread ideas, however unacceptable, however hateful they may be, and they're undeniably racist, but that still doesn't mean that we should ban them.
Axiomatic Events say it's too late to try and organise a new venue, but they hope to still host an evening with Ms Southern and Mr Molyneux for New Zealanders via the internet. For Checkpoint, Emma Hatton.
Coming up to 20 minutes past 5, the trade war, tariff war between the US and China is now underway. It began at 1 minute past midnight Eastern Standard Time, 1 minute past 4 our time, so about an hour 20 ago, and it will last until when? The initial sum is relatively small. Tariffs are being imposed on $34 billion of Chinese imports, but the rhetoric is bellicose and the sums involved may get very, very large. And then what? Beijing has said it will respond. The US has said it will respond to their response. Deborah Elms is the head of the Asian Trade Centre in Singapore. I spoke to her a short time ago about a standoff that seems to have no obvious solution.
Yes, yeah, and that's where it gets very complicated. I mean, we've never been in a situation like this, so it's a little unclear how this ends. And I think the difficulty from, someone who's been watching this for quite some time is there is no obvious off-ramp. Normally, when you impose something like a tariff, it's at the end of negotiations, and the negotiations have failed, and so you impose a punishment. We've got this upside down and backwards, where we're imposing the punishment ahead of the negotiations. And so how do you then negotiate after you've imposed a punishment is unclear.
Yes, even as you say that, I try and make sense of this situation, and it's impossible to do so. The question is, where does President Trump stop? And if we look at this rather extraordinary conversation he had with reporters on Air Force One, he's talking about tariffs on goods of up to $500 million, which are currently being held in abeyance, his word. And that doesn't seem to be the end of it. He is already escalating.
Yeah, well, I mean, the escalation goes from the $30+ billion to $50 billion. That comes in about 2 weeks because the U.S. changed its original $50 billion list a little bit after they had public hearings and discussions about that because they swapped out a few things on the list, and they needed to give sufficient time for the customs authorities in the U.S. to be prepared for these new items. So there's definitely an escalation coming in about 2 weeks as another $16 or so billion comes into effect. The question is what happens after that? Does it go from the $30 billion plus $16 billion to an additional $200 billion to an additional who knows what? Or does it stop, and at what point does it stop? I mean, I think that's where we really are in murky waters.
We are. What's a win look like here? What does a win look like for President Trump? What's his end game?
Well, I think one of the reasons why this is so complicated to imagine the end is that he and his group of advisors all have different views on what the end looks like. For Trump, it looks like he wants a reduction in the tariff deficit vis-a-vis the United States. For some of his advisors, they want a fundamental restructuring of the Chinese economy, and they especially want a restructuring of the Made in 2025 initiative in China. That is both of those goals are difficult, but restructuring the Chinese economy, of course, is extremely difficult, and getting the Chinese to renounce Made in 2025, I think, is going to be impossible. So somewhere in between there, you have to decide what is the end goal, and then how would the Chinese actually meet that if they wanted to do so. And I think that's why it's so difficult to imagine how this ends, because let's just say, for the sake of argument, the Chinese said, we want this to be done today, and we're prepared to do whatever it takes. They're not sure what that would look like. Okay, we're ready to end. Fantastic. Now what? Nobody seems to even know who do you call, who do you talk to, what would you have to do. And I think that is where people who expect this to end quickly are terribly misguided.
Yeah, as you said earlier, it's hard to imagine how it even ends at all. You are at the Asian Trade Centre, and of course, New Zealand is down the bottom of that region, and we very much, since Prime Minister Jim Bolger, have seen ourselves as part of Asia. What does it mean for trading nations in the wider Asian region and in the world, who are not directly involved in this at all, but who will inevitably be, at some level, collateral damage?
Well, I think it's a sort of good news, bad news thing. On the bright side, for countries like New Zealand, what it has done is it's dramatically escalated the enthusiasm for alternative arrangements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So good news for New Zealand is that we thought it might be difficult to get the Trans-Pacific Partnership through some countries like Canada, and as a result of Trump's trading policies, Canada has escalated their ratification procedures, and it should be done even in Canada by early next year, which is much faster than I had originally anticipated. So we're stabilizing the global economy in other areas that will be beneficial for a place like New Zealand. On the flip side, though, the collateral damage can be significant. The U.S. market remains a very important driver of global growth, and if that market stops functioning as it has for 70 years as a stabilizer for the world, then that presents all sorts of challenges. And if the global trading regime as a whole, which we have counted on to make sure that trade continues to function, and if that stops, then that is deeply problematic for all of us. So it's a sort of good news, bad news thing, and the question is how far does this whole assault on the trading order go before the U.S. administration pulls back or is reined in, and by whom?
That is the question. Deborah Elms, who is Executive Director of the Asian Trade Centre. So the tariff war, the trade war, is now formally underway. I spoke to Deborah just before we came on air. Last night we looked at banks and targets for bank staff and the kind of pressure on them to meet those targets, and the targets might involve selling you stuff you don't want or giving you credit you don't need or whatever. Anyway, we received an enormous amount of feedback on Colin Young's story last night, and a very long email came in just before we came on air. I'm not going to read it all because it's too long, but it is worth reading as much of it as we can fit in. It begins, "Hi John, listen to last night's article with interest. I spent 25 years with two of the major Australian-owned banks. The last 12 years in the retail bank lending money and managing a portfolio of high net worth customers. My career in banking ended August 2017, so this time last year basically. Banking of today has lost its moral compass. In today's environment, the focus is on product flogging, irrespective of the customer's needs or wants. Targets increase year on year, and if you do not meet your targets, if you do meet your targets, they're simply increased the following year, at times in the order of 20%. The majority of retail bankers want to do the best thing for their customers. However, they are expected to flog product with a morning meeting. What are you doing today? A midday catch-up. How are you going? And end of day, what have you achieved? Unfortunately, customers are looked at on the basis of what I can sell. One of the worst examples I saw was a young staff member who'd been told to sell life insurance, spending 30 minutes convincing a customer to take life insurance. The customer had come into the branch to arrange a small overdraft as he was unable to keep his account in credit. Unbelievable. But what gets measured gets done, and this lacking in moral compass goes way beyond branch and regional management. Well done for highlighting. Banks have only got themselves to blame for customers' lack of trust and the rise of smaller operators. Thanks, Vaughan, for that email. We really appreciate it, and your feedback on that subject, particularly those of you with experience inside the banking sector, is very welcome. It's 28 minutes past 5. Rotorua Lakes Council is rushing through consents for a homeless shelter so people don't have to be shaken awake every half hour because they're not allowed to sleep there. The man who started the shelter, Tiny Dean, is frustrated because the premises is fully equipped for people to have a comfortable night. But a lack of council fire and structural checks means guests have to stay awake at all hours. Matthew Tunison reports.
Up to 50 people a night have been using the shelter since it opened a month ago. The shelter's founder, Tiny Dean, was under the impression the council would turn a blind eye to people sleeping the night. But he was told yesterday they're not allowed to fall asleep there until the necessary consents are granted. As a result, he's had to instruct staff to shake homeless guests every half hour to comply with the council's rules.
I was purely just going on the humanitarian side of things. I didn't want anyone to die on the streets of Rotorua through hypothermia and being cold if they were on synthetics and they just fell asleep without covering themselves up, because down here, even last night, I think it was -2. She was pretty white on the grass.
Tiny Dean says the mattresses are now piled up and guests have to sit on couches, and security's been increased because some get agitated when they're denied their sleep. One of the guests is 87 and several are in their 70s. 9 of the homeless have recently found jobs and went to work today without any sleep. Mr. Dean says the council's requirements are unnecessary, given the shelter is far safer than the freezing cold streets.
Like, it's working.
Yeah.
This is all working, and I was trying to tell the council, think of the greater picture.
Rotorua Lakes Council Māori Group Manager Gina Rangi says fire and building consents are being rushed through so people can sleep at the shelter. Gina Rangi says the council is committed to working with Mr. Dean and will cover the costs of the consents. She says Mr. Dean had agreed that the shelter would not be set up as dormitory-style accommodation. How Mr. Dean enforces that requirement is up to him.
Mr. Dean's working with some of the most vulnerable people in our community, and we really take our hats off to him for the work that he's doing to serve them. What we had agreed with Mr. Dean was that it could operate as a drop-in centre, so people could have shelter from the weather. That did not include sleeping facilities because there are concerns about whether the building is safe for people to do that.
Ms. Rangi says letting homeless people sleep all night poses safety hazards.
You're working with people who are really vulnerable, may have a number of other issues going on, so it has to be safe.
Mr. Dean, who's the co-founder of a charity called Visions for a Helping Hand, mortgaged his house in order to set up 4 centres for the region's disadvantaged. He says he remains committed to getting people off the streets and back on their feet. For Checkpoint, ko Matthew Tunis and Tēnei.
You are with Checkpoint on RNZ, and thank you for being with us on a Friday night. Coming up, the Auckland woman who got a loan to help build a wheelchair-friendly home and says she was then denied some of her benefit. Back to the future for the target for women on state sector boards. A woman would have read that intro better too. We'd love your feedback. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, Facebook Checkpoint with John Campbell, or email checkpoint@radionz.co.nz. We're also going to try to predict who's going to win the quarterfinals of the Football World Cup. Katrina Batten, before 6.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't care.
Fake it, Katrina.
I don't care. All I know is that the guy from Uruguay's got a sore something or other,
right.
And so he might not be playing.
Right.
Anyway, headlines. The Auckland Mayor has now pulled the plug on a public talk by 2 Canadians accused of encouraging hate speech. Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux are known for their alternative right-wing views on feminism, gender, immigration and Islam. Phil Goff this afternoon said they cannot use the Bruce Mason Centre as planned and they're not welcome in any other council-run venues. A rescue operation to free 12 boys and their football coach from the flooded cave in Thailand has been hit by tragedy. A former Thai Navy SEAL has died from lack of oxygen on his way out of the cave where he'd been delivering supplies. Saman Kunan had gone in to lay oxygen tanks along a potential exit route. For nearly 2 weeks, the boys have been stuck in a dark cave with freezing, fast-running water, and more monsoon rains are forecast in the coming days. The US and China are heading towards a full-blown trade war. The United States has hit China with 25% tariffs on about $34 billion worth of Chinese goods, including farm plows and semiconductors. Beijing is retaliating with tariffs on US exports such as soybeans, vehicles and pork. Skiers, trampers and hunters are being warned that an incoming storm will heighten the risk of avalanches. The Met Service says a slow-moving front will move up the country on Saturday and over the weekend, bringing rain, heavy snow and strong gusty winds. It'll make large areas of the South Island backcountry very dangerous for travel. Wellington's first ever Matariki festival has been postponed as a southern right whale shows no sign of leaving the harbour where it took up residence on Tuesday. The council's deputy mayor says although the fireworks display is unlikely to harm the whale, it could act unpredictably, endangering boaties and kayakers. An Inter-Islander ferry had to delay berthing today when the whale was seen near the terminal. The capital's Matariki Sky Show will be held in the harbour on July the 14th. And I have heard that some people have been stopping on the motorway near the Aotearoa ramp exit to stop and take photos.
Yeah, that'd be pretty lovely, really.
Hello.
Unless you got rear-ended, which wouldn't be much fun.
Well, exactly.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. Katrina Batten, a voice of reason at RNZ, ladies and gentlemen. And also a rugby fan, we should hasten to add. Right, let's turn to business news now with Matt Chatterton. Matt, hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, good. You care about the football, don't you?
Oh, totally.
Yeah, good man. Used car sales at the lowest for the year. It's winter though, aren't they? Don't they always dip this time of year, or is this actually meaningful?
Oh, this is meaningful. I mean, I care more about this than the football, I tell you. Turner's Cars have come out with these numbers. They are the country's biggest used car dealer. They say that dealer sales were down more than 2% in June on a year ago. And no, it's not necessarily because of the winter. They believe it's because of the stink bug scare. He says, the Turner CEO, Greg Hedgepeth, says it's not that people don't want to buy cars, it's that there aren't enough cars in the country at the moment, which, yeah, because of the stink bug scare. He said that it created a backlog which strained the infrastructure here once those cars entered New Zealand. He does note, though, that he doesn't expect this trend to continue. He thinks it's just a correction in the market and expects sales to rise again as it's more of a supply issue rather than demand issue.
Right, I think that made sense.
Hope it did.
Yeah, thanks, Matty. No, I'm sure, absolutely certain it did. The Reserve Bank believes our main banks are well prepared for future risks. I guess it's their job to ensure they are, right? So it's good that they're saying that.
Yes, indeed. Sort of a little bit relates to the stuff you were mentioning before the headlines, which I'll get to shortly. But the Reserve Bank says it's willing to let the big retail banks calculate the risk they are carrying, which will determine how much they have to hold in reserves and capital. This does come with some conditions, though. The central bank is reviewing the ways the risk to banks' capital reserves is calculated, what type of assets should be included, and how to ensure they don't cheat so they can get a competitive edge on the other banks. The Reserve Bank says it's willing to trust the major banks to use their own criteria about how much risk they're carrying from loans to various sectors such as dairy farmers, households, property developers, or even big companies. The level of risk determines how much cash and other securities the bank needs to keep in the reserve to cover any downturn or financial shock such as the global financial crisis of 2008. But it does also want to make sure that the banks aren't cheating. So if a bank was to underestimate the amount of risk, it would need to lower the level of reserves, and that would actually help boost the bank's profits. So the RBNZ says it will probably use a second set of risk calculations of an international standard, so that way there is an independent measuring tool, and it will make its final decision later in the year on what the final level of reserves banks need to have in their coffers are. It's worth noting that this is quite a trusting move from the RBNZ, given the timing of the investigations by both it and the FMA into the retail bank's sales tactics and ethics.
Yeah. Actually, that FMA investigation is going to be absolutely fascinating. Thanks, man.
It sure will.
How did the markets end the week?
Well, to end the week, the NZX closed up 21 points to 9,084. The US dollar is up ever so slightly to 68.1 US cents. The Oz is up as well. The Australian dollar is sitting at around 92 cents, and the British pound up to 51.5 pence. So, yeah, not bad.
Matt Chatterton, thank you very much indeed. Have a great weekend, Matty.
Same
An
here.
Auckland woman says she was denied some of her benefit because she got a loan from her uncle to help build a wheelchair-friendly home. It's another case that's come to light after a High Court decision this week that found the Ministry of Social Development was wrong to class a beneficiary's personal loans and credit card as income. The West Auckland woman, who is wheelchair-bound and a single mother of 4, has described trying to get support from working an income as, and I quote, a living hell. Eva Corlett visited her home.
I had an accident just over 5 years ago. I had a partner living with 4 daughters, and I was in hospital for 4 months, and he decided to leave. So we did have a home which I tried to keep but couldn't afford to, so we had to sell that. The bank forced me to sell it.
At that time, the woman had an accommodation supplement coming in, but that stopped when she got a $120,000 ACC payout for losing the use of her legs.
That payment caused me a big issue around being penalised, even though it was for my legs, which really was kind of upsetting because it was a small payment to lose your legs and try and get on with the next phase of your life. But again, I got penalised. I tried to fight them, but it was just impossible.
The family went from rental to rental, but finding a house for 4 children and someone with a wheelchair is tough.
I looked at every single type of rental around Auckland. They're all from having 5 of us, $650, $700. So it was impossible.
The woman says she needed her payout and the funds from her house sale to build an accessible house, but the family was dipping into the money every day to survive. Her parents stepped up after the family started living in a basement and allowed her to build a small granny flat at the back of their property. She saved every dollar of what remained of her payout to build it. It's a tiny flat. The downstairs bedroom, living room and kitchen are squeezed into one space. Upstairs, the girls share a couple of bedrooms. But when the bank refused to loan the woman the money to finish it, she went to an uncle for help. When she recently tried to get the accommodation supplement again, she says Wins told her the uncle's loan counted as income.
Unfortunately, I've just been lumbered, and trying to better myself has just not been to my advantage at all, trying to do the right thing.
The woman receives an invalid benefit and an IRD payment for her 2 youngest daughters, a total of $557 a week. Her older children, one who's a student and the eldest who's her carer and also works part-time, help cover her costs.
It's been 5 years of hell, basically, and also trying to live with your injury and all the other issues around that, and just having everything else just been such a battle. It's just been it's been living hell. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Anyone could be in my position. It's just bad luck.
Her 21-year-old daughter and carer says financial pressure takes its toll on the whole family.
And you start to worry about money yourself. Like, I find myself worrying about how we're going to get money for the next thing that comes up, or if mum's car, something happens to that, because I know that it's going to be a problem once it happens. You kind of start worrying about stuff that you shouldn't really have to worry about when you're the kid.
Viv Rickard from the Ministry of Social Development says the loan from her uncle was not the reason her accommodation supplement was refused. He says it was the cash from the ACC payout and the house sale that meant the woman was ineligible.
Once you earn over a certain amount, and in New Zealand, for her position, it's over $16,000. That's the legislation. We don't have the discretion and over and above that. It's just that at the time she had at around about 180,000 to 190,000 cash assets. Therefore, because of the way our law that we must follow, she wasn't eligible.
Despite what Mr Rickard says, the woman maintains MSD told her it was the loan that was to blame. Wins has been in touch with the woman since RNZ requested an interview. It says she may be eligible for support again and has set up an interview with her this afternoon to determine what that might be. I tamaki makaurau mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Eva Colette tēnei.
17.5 to 6. Britain and Russia have traded accusations, more of them, about the latest nerve agent poisoning in southwest England. A man and a woman remain critically ill in Salisbury after coming into contact with Novichok 4 months after the Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter were attacked in the city. Britain has accused Russia of treating the country like a dumping ground for poison. The Russian government says, off you go, and wants an apology. The ABC's UK correspondent Philip Williams has more.
In the quiet town of Amesbury, police have cordoned off a number of sites where Charlie Rowley and Dawn Sturgis may have visited in the hours before they started fitting and foaming at the mouth. At first, it was assumed they were victims of contaminated drugs, perhaps heroin or ice. But now the British government is convinced it's the same nerve agent that was used against the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in March. Security Minister Ben Wallace.
The nature of a nerve agent such as Novichok is it is an absolute tiny needle in a very large haystack that we have to find.
What's unclear is how the latest victims came in contact with the nerve agent. One theory is that they inadvertently touched something discarded after the first attack, but how and where simply isn't clear, nor can authorities say with absolute certainty that local residents are now safe from danger. Professor Alistair Hay is a toxicology expert with Leeds University.
Some agents take a long time to degrade and they can last for years in the environment, and this particular one may be very similar to one of those.
What is certain is the British government believes, whether by accident or design, that the Russian state is behind this. Home Secretary Sajid Jarvis.
Let me be clear. We do not have a quarrel with the Russian people.
Rather, it is the actions of the Russian government that continue to undermine our security and that of the international community. It is completely unacceptable for our people to be either deliberate or accidental targets, or for our streets, our parks, our towns to be dumping grounds for poison.
The Russian government has demanded an apology from the UK. We urge the British law enforcement not to get involved in dirty political games and certain powers in London, says Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova. She accused the British government of demanding Russian cooperation, then ignoring Moscow's offers of a joint investigation. With President Trump in Europe and London next week ahead of his Helsinki summit with Vladimir Putin, the politics of poisoning will make for a complex diplomatic cocktail. Just as President Trump moves to repair relations with his Russian counterpart, Donald Trump's European allies may be heading in the opposite direction.
Philip Williams reporting from London. The government is revisiting a 20-year-old goal to ensure women make up half of public boards and committees by 2021. The Minister for Women, Julianne Genter, made this announcement in Auckland this morning to a room packed to the brim with female leaders. Katie Scotcher was at the announcement and she filed this report.
Ms Genter announced the government was reviving the 20-year-old target at the Women in Leadership breakfast in Auckland this morning, and it received a warm reception. The original 50-50 target set in 1998 was dropped in 2011 by then Minister Pansy Wong, who deemed it unlikely to be hit. She dropped it to a 45% target, and last year that goal was met. Ms Genter said today that it was time the 50-50 target was revisited.
The only reason we don't have 50% women on boards is because there's systemic discrimination against women, historic discrimination. It's not because women aren't qualified. There are plenty of qualified, hardworking women.
By 2021, in 3 years' time, all state sector boards will be evenly represented by women and men. Ms Genter doesn't think this will be a challenge.
I think there's more than enough qualified women, and other diverse minorities we need to look at as well. We need to look at ethnic diversity, ensuring people with disabilities are represented on boards.
While the government has revived its 50-50 commitment for the public sector, women in senior leadership roles in the private sector sits at a 14-year low. This year's Grant Thornton International Women in Business survey found only 18% of women were in senior leadership roles in the private sector, the lowest since the survey began in 2004. Ms Genter hopes the government's new target will prompt the private sector to do more to change that.
The reason the public sector has made progress on this is because we've had targets and a deliberate effort to increase diversity. The private sector needs to catch up. Only at 19% women on private sector boards. I want to know what the private sector is going to do to increase diversity.
In a room full of women, Rob Campbell, the chair of Sky City, was one of few men in attendance. He offered a solution for encouraging more men to attend meetings of this kind.
We might have to organise a men's event to look at the issue and see whether the guys would turn up then. The issue's not going to go away simply by not turning up to the meetings.
There are 7 members on Sky City's board of directors. 5 are men and 2 are women. And Mr Campbell says the company is working on improving those numbers.
I know we're making progress. We'll be making further appointments this year, and it's an important part of the criterion, and it can be done. You know, it doesn't happen instantly.
The chair of the National Advisory for the Employment for Women, Tracy Hopapa, says having gender diverse public and private boards isn't routine yet, and that needs to change. She says the government's 50% target sets a clear benchmark.
It shows that there is a commitment to progress and there is a commitment to implementing the conversation and the strategy. So that's important.
Ms Genter's office says a list of the boards and committees that don't meet the target will be made public if the deadline is not met. I tamaki makaurau mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Katie Scotcher tēnei.
You're with Checkpoint. It's coming up to 11 minutes to 6. A manhunt ended in Sydney this morning when a father who's believed to have shot dead his 2 children last night was himself found dead. This has shaken Sydney's North Shore. A 15-year-old boy and a 13-year-old girl were killed in their bedrooms in the home they shared with their mother. It's believed there was a custody dispute over the children. The ABC's Catherine Gregory has the story.
Police and forensic investigators line a leafy, quiet street in the northwestern Sydney suburb of West Pennant Hills. They're trying to determine how and why a father, John Edwards, shot dead his 2 teenage children at their home yesterday afternoon.
These 2 children were subject of horrific homicide. What we do know from the information available to us, this was a planned activity on the part of the 68-year-old male, and we are of the belief that shortly thereafter he's attended the address at Normanhurst and taken his own life.
Acting Assistant Commissioner Brett McFadden says police found John Edwards dead early this morning. With him was 2 shotguns described as powerful weapons, one of which was used to kill the children aged 13 and 15. Police found them dead in their bedrooms.
We understand that those handguns came into his possession lawfully earlier this year.
It's still unclear the nature of the relationship the father had with the children, but it does appear the parents were separated. The 36-year-old mother is being treated for extreme shock.
So the exact circumstances of the relationship is still being confirmed. I do know it was a long-term relationship, and I do know that there were some custody hearings over the last 2 years.
Acting Assistant Commissioner Brett McFadden says police are still looking into the father's history, but they're not aware of any AVOs against him.
We have knowledge of this person, but it's not extensive, and there's nothing that's what I would say would be contemporary. So we are getting information from a variety of sources that are guiding the investigation for the interests of the coroner. I don't believe it's extensive, and if it was many years ago.
Neighbours have told the ABC that the father, John Edwards, had a violent history. Yet they're still shocked that such a harrowing incident happened in the area. Julian Lisa is the federal member for Berowra in northwestern Sydney. He says it's unusual for this area to be associated with such violent crime.
It's a great shock to everybody in the community. This is an area of Sydney which is known for having very strong community, strong families. It's a place where people get involved, people know their neighbours. The community is very tight-knit, and this strikes very deeply. My thoughts today are with the mother of those 2 poor innocent children who is dealing with unimaginable grief.
That's MP Julian Lissa ending Catherine Gregory's report from Sydney. The hopes and dreams of just 8 nations remain alive in the Football World Cup, and by the end of the weekend that will be down to 4. Uruguay play France, Belgium play Brazil, those 2 games tomorrow morning. On Sunday it's Russia, Croatia and England, Sweden. Clay Wilson is our sports reporter, and we've gone through all 4 games, starting with France, Uruguay. A very exciting prospect indeed, Clay.
It is. It's certainly shaping. Well, both games on this side of the draw are shaping as epic games. I guess France probably have their noses in front in this one. They had a brilliant 4-3 win over Argentina in the round of 16 and just showed what they can really do. It's a team, a young team full of real potential match winners in that side. So I would say they go in with their noses in front, but Uruguay have been very good. They've got every chance in this game. Probably the best defensive team so far at this tournament. So they're going to be very hard to break down, and they've got 2 strikers up front, superstars Cavani, Luis Suarez. These guys have been in good touch scoring goals, so certainly not out of the question.
No, it's a mouth-watering prospect. No, OK, I'm going to ask you every time to pick a result. Who are you picking? This is a tough one.
Yeah, I've got France. I think they're probably just going to have a little bit too much on the day. They've just got match winners really all across the park, and probably just a little bit too much.
Yeah. Belgium, Brazil?
Yeah, I think this is probably the game of the quarterfinals potentially. There's so many great players. There's probably be a really highly entertaining game, I would say. Brazil have to be the favourites. For me, they are the favourites to win the tournament.
Are they still?
Well, I think in a lot of people's eyes, Brazil and France are neck and neck here, but I think Brazil, they've just got a lot of class all over the pitch, and they've really been building to this point. They've been improving gradually as the tournament's gone on. But you look at a team like Belgium, they're similar to France, quite young, but just so much class, a lot of really, really good, talented young players. It really depends on what Belgian team turns up. They were brilliant in a couple of their group games, but against Japan, obviously, went down 2-0 and were playing terribly, and then just came to life in the last half an hour and scored 3 goals, the last one of which was just a goal from the end of the earth to win the game. So they've got their potential.
I just didn't think they'd button on against Japan. They just thought it was a fait accompli. They were going to beat them, and no one was engaged. And then when it mattered, boy, they clicked, didn't they?
Yeah, it's that old complacency thing. Sometimes you can talk about it, but when you actually get out there, there's just nothing you can do, and it takes you to get in that situation where it's life or death, and hey, you really need to buck up your ideas or you're gone, and that's what happened, and they really just fired into life and showed what they could do.
Don't hit me, Clay, don't kick me. So that's a Neymar joke, a Neymar overreaction. I want to clarify to Radio New Zealand listeners that Clay didn't hit or kick me, but you wrote a good column about Neymar and his, it's feeble. For such a magnificent football player, for a guy who earned so much money and plays the game so well, to behave in such a childish, infantile, embarrassing fashion. How do you rein that behaviour in? At what stage is the game? I mean, I thought the Colombians were appalling too against the English, and their conduct around the referee, there should have been yellow cards all over the shop. At what stage is Well Football going to say, stop behaving like this? Grown men, stop behaving like this.
Yeah, well, that's what it's going to take, because the players themselves aren't going to stop. It doesn't matter how much you criticise these players or how much the coaches come under fire for taking some action here. They're not going to do it. They've been getting away with it for so long. It really is, the onus is on FIFA here to step in and say, hey, we've had enough, and start dishing out the cards, start just saying it's not acceptable. If that means that it has an adverse effect on the game, we start seeing 8 versus 9, say, then so be it. Perhaps it's a bit of short-term pain for long-term betterment.
It won't happen for long, will it? I mean, if people start getting yellow carded for yelling at the ref or for doing these Hollywoods, it will only happen for a few weeks before people get the message, surely.
You would like to think so, but these football stars are highly paid and become accustomed to getting everything they want. So,
right, Game 3, Russia-Croatia, and that Russian crowd. Boy, oh boy, this is a prospect, isn't it?
And the Russian team's really riding the wave of that home support. And of course, they just knocked out Spain. Spain, just 2 tournaments ago, were the champions. So they've certainly got ability, but Croatia they were a little bit poor in their round of 16 game, but really they've probably got too much for Russia here, I think. They've got some real stars in there who are just capable of doing some brilliant things, and I would say that this is probably the end of the road for Russia, and Croatia will just step it up a gear from that round of 16 game.
Wow. So you've picked Brazil over Belgium, you've picked France, and you're picking Croatia over Russia.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. And the fourth and final game is England-Sweden. What beautiful memes we've had. Gosh, the English fans have been hilarious, haven't they? Because and now, I mean, this is when they're most vulnerable. They're daring to believe, bless them.
Yeah, I guess us as Kiwis, sometimes we like to enjoy the misery of the English, but you can't help but admire the passion either way of how much they get into this football. Some of the celebrations and the footage of them watching that penalty shootout against the other day, that round of 16 game was just brilliant. So we'll see. I think on paper this is a much more even fixture than a lot of people are giving it credit for. England should have too much for Sweden, but
really,
but I would think that Sweden are going to be very, very hard to get past. And of course, that Sweden have history on their side here. The last 8 games between these two teams, England have only won once. So despite a lot of people thinking that England are heavy favourites here, it's not quite as one-sided as you would think.
Clay Wilson, boy, it's exciting. Anyway, 2.5 to 6, let's get on with it because we can fit this in before 6. A young entrepreneur, once afraid of heights, wants to build the country's highest wooden structure, a bungee tower in the middle of Waitomo fast farmland. John Heskett's seeking resource consent for the 70-metre high tower and more. Rowan Quinn reports.
John Heskett used to be afraid of heights, but says working at the A.J. Hackett Bungee in Queenstown cured that. Now the 26-year-old's out to get others to take the leap in the King Country.
To the very top is going to sit around 70 metres, but the actual jump platform will be 55 metres. And that's a really cool height to jump off. I've done a few bungee jumps in my life, and 55 metres is kind of in the fun zone, you know. It's not super high where it's too high where you're not going to do it, and it's not short enough where you're not going to get a rush.
John sold his scaffolding business to work full-time on the plan. He wants the tower to be wooden to help it stay in keeping with its natural setting, and he plans to make the gardens part of the attraction. In an artist's image, it looks a bit like an air traffic control tower looming out of the surrounding paddocks, with a pool, some bush and buildings at its base. There's a long way to go with millions of dollars of investment needed, but the resource consents are lodged and he wants to make it happen.
It's going to be a sculpture. It is amazing. Like the team that's helped me design this, I'm just a kid with the idea. I've had such an amazing team help me design this, and I mean what they've produced is just unreal. So once you're driving through Waitomo, it's definitely going to open your eyes, and you're going to want to come have a look and maybe jump off it.
Waitomo's Mayor Brian Hanna is firmly backing the plan, saying it would be a big deal for the area. The glowworm caves are a huge tourist pool, but very few visitors stay the night.
The more economic activity we can generate, the longer we can keep people and break that cycle of people coming to the caves between sort of 11 and 2 and disappearing out of our district again. If we can keep them longer, that just creates more opportunity for us.
Waitomo locals will get the chance to formally have their say on whether the attraction should be built when the resource consent application's publicly notified. For Checkpoint, ko Rowan Quinn, DNA.
Thank you, Rowan. It's coming up to 6 o'clock, about 16 seconds away. A lot of feedback coming in from people who have worked in and with banks about targets, incentives and more, and we're going to get in touch with some of you. Thank you very much.
RNZ News at 6. Ngā mihi nui, good evening. Ko Katrina Batten aho. A public talk by 2 Canadians accused of hate speech has been cancelled after the Auckland Mayor Phil Goff banned them from all council venues. Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux are best known for their alternative right-wing views on issues including feminism, gender, immigration and Islam. Mr Goff announced this afternoon the pair cannot use the Bruce Mason Centre as planned next month and are not welcome in any other council-run venues. He says the decision has been made for security reasons. The promoter says it's too late to find another venue, but he hopes to organise an online event for the pair. Those who have bought tickets for the Auckland talk will be refunded. The operation to save a group of boys and their soccer coach trapped in a cave in northern Thailand has taken a tragic turn after a volunteer rescuer died. Former Thai Navy SEAL Saman Kunan, who was 37, was placing oxygen tanks in the cave in preparation for the rescue and died from a loss of oxygen while trying to dive out. It's unclear if the oxygen tank malfunctioned or ran out. A fellow diver, Mikko Pasi from Finland, says it's a tragic blow to the rescue effort, but the focus is staying on trying to get the boys out.
Definitely you can feel it, that it has an effect, but we're moving on. Everybody's a professional, so we're trying to put it away and avoid it never happen again. Everybody is focusing, getting them out, keeping them alive or getting them out.
Finnish diver Mikko Pasi. The Thai king has instructed local officials to hold an honourable funeral service for Saman Kunan. Meanwhile, there's still no word on any decision to push ahead with getting the boys out ahead of forecast monsoon rain. Rotorua Lakes Council is rushing through consents for a homeless shelter so people don't have to be shaken awake every half an hour because they're not allowed to sleep there. The man who started the shelter, Tiny Dean, is frustrated because the shelter is fully equipped for people to have a comfortable night. But a lack of council fire and structural checks means guests have to stay awake at all times. Rotorua Lakes Council's Gina Rangi says fire and building consents are being rushed through so people can sleep at the shelter. But she says letting them sleep there before the consents are complete poses safety hazards.
You're working with people who are really vulnerable, may have a number of other issues going on, so it has to be safe.
Gina Rangi says the council is committed to working with Mr Dean and will cover the cost of the consents. Wellington's first Matariki fireworks festival has been postponed as a southern right whale in the harbour shows no signs of moving on. The whale has been a star attraction since it arrived on Tuesday. Wellington City Council has decided to postpone the Sky Show scheduled for Saturday to avoid disturbing it. The acting mayor, Jill Day, says the Department of Conservation believes fireworks noise is unlikely to harm the whale, but it could act unpredictably, affecting boats and kayakers. An inter-islander ferry had to delay docking today after the whale was spotted in front of the terminal. The fireworks have been postponed until July the 14th. The largest ski area in the South Island says it's on avalanche alert ahead of a large storm due this weekend. Treble Cone says it's watching the weather closely. The New Zealand Mountain Safety Council is warning skiers, trampers and hunters that the storm, set to bring up to 3 metres of snow in some areas, will heighten the risk of avalanches in the backcountry. Treble Cone spokesman Richard Birkby says decisions are weighed up daily on whether to close the field.
And that decision is informed by the management team and the ski patrol based on
a number of factors, one of which is the weather and the avalanche hazard that comes with that. So after this storm has passed through, or as this storm is passing through every day, we will be making that decision.
Richard Birkby says the safety of skiers and staff will guide the decision. Met Service says a slow-moving front will move up the country on Saturday and through the weekend, bringing heavy snow, rain and strong gusty winds. The US and China are now on the path to a full-blown trade war. A short time ago, the US went ahead and slapped 25% tariffs on some $34 billion of Chinese goods, ranging from farm plows to semiconductors and aeroplane parts. Beijing is retaliating in kind with tariffs going on US exports such as soybeans, vehicles and pork. The Trump administration has warned it may ultimately target more than $500 billion worth of Chinese imports, roughly the total amount that the US imported from China last year. It's 6:05. Sport. New Zealand Football expects recently resigned Chief Executive Andy Martin to take part in an independent investigation into the conduct and culture of the organisation. The national body has confirmed a broader scope for the review into the environment within the football ferns, with employment lawyer Philippa Muir hired to lead the process. Martin unexpectedly resigned just 9 days after it was confirmed there'd be an investigation. But New Zealand Football President Derek Shaw says he's heard second-hand that Martin is likely to contribute.
There's no obligation for him to be questioned, as I understand. That's really a matter for him to make a determination on. We understand that he's likely to make himself available for it, but that's really a matter for him to determine.
Derek Shaw. The Warriors coach Stephen Kearney says coming up against Penrith side tonight without their state of origin players makes them unpredictable. The fourth-placed Panthers are without origin trio Tyrone Peachey, Nathan Cleary and James Maloney. The Warriors are just behind them in the standings and Kearney is wary about the home side.
These guys, they set the pace of the competition for the first 10 or 12 weeks. They play a really exciting brand of footy and we've got to make sure that we execute our plan really well with plenty of energy and commitment, and then we give ourselves an opportunity.
Stephen Kearney. And the Highlanders can expect a particularly hostile reception when they tackle the table-topping Crusaders in Christchurch tonight. After playing 8 seasons for the Crusaders, Aaron Major is in his first year as Highlanders coach and returns to coach in his city of birth for the first time. That's the news.
Tomorrow morning, Judge Andrew Beecroft, 2 years into his job as Children's Commissioner. Vincent Ward lights up Nelson. Simon Kerler wonders how we know what mental health really means. And it had to happen. Shorty gets set to music. They don't call it soap opera for nothing. Join me, Kim Hill, tomorrow morning from 8 here on RNZ National.
Met surface weather through to midnight tomorrow, and severe weather warnings and watches are in place for parts of southern and central New Zealand. So for western and central areas from Northland to Manawatu, excluding Taranaki. Mainly fine, cloud increasing tomorrow with drizzle patches, then rain south of Waitomo later. Taranaki and Horowhenua to Wellington, cloudy areas with patchy drizzle. Rain tomorrow, heavy about the ranges. Northwest gales in Wellington tomorrow. Gisborne to Wairarapa, mainly fine, however tomorrow in Wairarapa, rain and gale northwesterlies developing. Nelson, fine today, rain tomorrow, heavy at times. Bulla to Fiordland, drizzle patches, but heavy rain south of the glaciers, spreading north tomorrow, then easing. Northwest gales in Fiordland for a time. Marlborough, Canterbury, Otago and Southland, high cloud with patchy rain south of Ashburton today. Rain spreading elsewhere for a time tomorrow with heavy falls near the Divide. Northwest gales in places for a time and the Chatham Islands cloudy periods. It's exactly 6:08 and you're listening to Checkpoint.
Thank you very much indeed, Katrina Batten. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too, John.
Thank you. We will not let his life be in vain. We will carry on. Those were the words of the commander of the Thai Navy SEALs today after it was revealed a rescuer had died during an operation to save 12 boys and their coach from a flooded cave complex. The man died on Thursday night after entering the cave to lay oxygen tanks along a potential exit route, the only way out. It's going to be a hell of a job getting them out, and they're putting oxygen tanks there in readiness. Correspondent Richard Ehrlich is in Thailand, and I asked him if this death stressed the magnitude of the task facing the rescuers.
Yes, and this is the worst case, that everyone had feared that somebody would perish. And, of course, all eyes were on these 12 boys and their coach. And I don't think anyone expected the experienced SEAL divers to have this kind of a problem. Now, he's a 38-year-old former SEAL, which means he had been trained in underwater maneuvers, this kind of thing. And they said that he was, actively a jogger, a bicyclist. He was in excellent condition, and that he lost consciousness from a lack of oxygen while he was placing oxygen tanks all along the route of this underground river, which is rushing through this cave. And what they had been trying to do is lay a long cable, a rope, from where the 13 people are trapped all the way along this 4 kilometers out to the entrance, so that the boys who don't have scuba diving experience could strap on a face mask. Essentially, it looks like a gas mask, which allows them to receive oxygen from an umbilical cord tied to 2 Navy SEAL divers who would escort them. And they would merely walk on the bottom of this underground river the entire length of the way, accompanied by their escorts. At some point in the middle of all this, there is an area where the roof, the ceiling, the limestone rock ceiling veers down so sharply to the floor, it almost touches the ground. You have to take off your equipment, and this is the dangerous part. Now, we don't know where this former SEAL died, but he was laying down these tanks, supposedly every 25 meters. If anybody runs out of oxygen, there's a nearby tank to grab, and he himself died about 8 hours ago. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning here.
Richard, one of the really sobering things about this is that he was with a buddy. And so the buddy, who also was a Navy SEAL or a former Navy SEAL or a highly trained scuba diver with the experience of caving too, was unable to save him. Now, these were 2 people who knew what they were doing, whereas with the football team and their coach, we are dealing with people who have absolutely no idea how to handle the situation. So it really is an imposing prospect now, isn't it, getting those children out?
Yes, and we're still wondering, why this former SEAL did lose oxygen. Now, when you do your scuba diving, of course, he's equipped with a wristwatch and other equipment that tells him how much time he's been down there, how much oxygen he has, what the pressure is, and this kind of gauges that he can look at and refer to. But the problem with this water is it's so muddy, and it's, of course, so dark in the cave, you can't even see your hand in front of your face. So did he run out of air because he wasn't able to monitor his own watch? Did he hit his head in the fast current against a rock? Because this is all stalactites hanging down from the ceiling, stalagmites coming up from the ground. This is yet to be determined what exactly caused him to fall unconscious.
So much euphoria when the boys and their coach were found alive, and a sense that this had been solved, that the trip out would not be nearly as hard as the rescue mission to find them. And now I guess people must be feeling very, very tense again after this news.
Well, this is the worst case, and this is it takes them several hours, skilled divers, to go from the entrance to reach them. They have to swim upstream, essentially, and it takes them about 4 hours to come back down. And this is a professional diver moving right along. And, of course, taking one of these kids out, it's going to be a much slower thing. But now, who wants to take a vulnerable child who has no experience like this, who's also traumatized from the entire problem that he's had for the past 2 weeks, and also malnourished and weakened? Who wants to take them out under these conditions when this person has died? And the only other alternative, of course, is having them sit there longer. But the problem now we have is the monsoon is coming back, and it could dump rain later today, tomorrow, the next day, but it's supposedly coming within days. And they think that this could cause so much flooding that, again, these 13 people, who are now assisted by a handful of Navy SEALs and medical staff that are also with them, they could be cut off again and wouldn't be able to receive food or any other supply. So they're stockpiling food against that danger.
Richard Ehrlich, it's the most amazing situation. We've been told for days now that it is very, very difficult to get those 12 young schoolboys out and their coach, and this really does give a terrible demonstration of just how difficult it is. 14 minutes past 6, the bulk of New Zealand's foreign aid goes and has always gone to the Pacific Islands for obvious reasons. That's the hood we're in. But more than $200 million will be given to Southeast Asia over the next 3 years, nearly 12% of our total aid, which is not high on a GDP basis. Little reporting is done on where that money goes, who it helps, or what sort of return is received on investment. Our reporter Zach Fleming wanted to change that, so he travelled to Vietnam earlier this year, courtesy of the Asia New Zealand Foundation, for a series of stories. This was part 2 of that trip. Recently we brought you the story of 2 young New Zealand women helping save Vietnam's moon bears. Today a visit to a remote mountainous region in central Vietnam, where our government is giving more than $2 million to try and pull ethnic minorities out of abject poverty. But, as Zach reports, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is refusing to be interviewed about the project.
3 keys turn simultaneously and the small beige lockbox opens. Context stripped, these women could be in a bunker or a submarine launching a nuclear missile. But these coffee growers are actually opening their vault because the nearest bank is a 3-hour round trip from here. Until recently, saving wasn't in their vocabulary.
Before World Vision, I grew coffee but only got a small harvest. Life was very, very difficult.
Mrs. Ho Ti Bick, a 38-year-old single mother of a 9-year-old boy, has lived in Ralai village her entire life. It's in the Hoang Hoa district in the Quang Tri province, smack bang in the middle of Vietnam, just 20 minutes from the border with Laos. She used to earn just 30 New Zealand dollars a year, abject poverty regardless of definition. And if living off 8 cents a day wasn't already hard enough, Mrs. Bick has no hands and no access to social welfare. Her parents were poor farmers, so when her hands were injured in a fire when she was a baby, they were cut off. Her house is a hut, 1 room around the size of an average Kiwi bedroom. It's also her kitchen, her lounge, her everything. Made of bamboo, there's gaps in all of the walls and the floor, and the roof is corrugated iron. It's deafening when it rains. Money is spent on essentials. Her son walks the 3 kilometres to school because they can't afford a motorbike.
When we get more income this year, I want to buy more clothes for my son because in the past he only had 1 set of clothes. So I want to buy more clothes for him and educational material and more food for him so he can learn more at school.
That's past tense now though. Her son had 1 set of clothes, until a nearly $3 million aid partnership between World Vision and our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade reached her village. It's a teach a man how to fish, feed him for a lifetime typed project, targeting just 1,000 households. The director of World Vision Vietnam, Tran Tu Huyen, is born and bred Vietnamese, and she told me it's the worst poverty she's ever seen.
The disparity between the rich and the poor and urban and rural and also mountainous and lowland is still very high.
In one district in the Quang Tri province, more than 85% of people live below the poverty line, which means they're earning less than or just over $1 a day. Some are trying to support families on that dollar. The child malnutrition rate in these districts tops 30%. When I visited, Mrs. Bick and her neighbours were being taught how to make their own organic fertiliser from the discarded pulp of coffee cherries. It's a simple process. The pulp is shoveled into a large pile, layered with fertiliser helper, more pulp, more fertiliser helper, and then some leaves and organic matter on top. Cover it with a tarpaulin, leave it for a few months, and easy. A cheap, sustainable way for these farmers to make organic fertiliser, and therefore organic coffee. the hope is that come this time next year, when the crop can be called organic thanks to the new fertiliser, they'll fetch around 50% more on the market, netting these farmers a 50% increase in income. Lee Du Hiet is a market facilitator for World Vision in Vietnam. He helps connect the farmers to the buyers.
When they are poor, they are the most vulnerable. They will not be respected. They don't have the confidence. And by implementing the project activities, they become more and more empowered in the community, and they become more confident.
Mrs. Bick's income has increased from just $30 a year to now around $200 a year. She's still living below the poverty line, but it's a start.
The starting point is a very, very poor. So for us, those changes are very, very significant. Some successful families, farmers, they can increase up to three times their income of the last year harvest.
World Vision says 71% of households have reported an increase in revenue since the aid project started.
We help them to work as producer groups so that they can save costs on the input, but can gain more price when they buy things or selling things as a group. And we help them to link to the buyer and to the company, coffee company, so that they can ensure the price, and they also can support one another when the price fluctuates.
The project has been going for 3 years now, though, and with New Zealand providing the bulk of the money through our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, $2.1 million against World Vision's $700,000, I wanted to ask MFAT if a third of the households seeing no increase in income is good value for that money. At the New Zealand Embassy in Hanoi, MFAT staff were told not to talk, because MFAT staff back in New Zealand would be interviewed. But then, when I got back to New Zealand, bizarrely, MFAT said no to my interview requests and refused to explain why the change of heart. MFAT's media team instead just offered a written statement attributed to nobody, saying that there is evidence of progress.
52 producer groups formed, 1,200 people trained, and 34 producer groups are now linked to buyers.
Asked what checks are done to make sure New Zealand's $2.1 million is being spent well, the unattributed statement said,
MFAT undertakes quality assurance processes throughout the life of a project. World Vision New Zealand provides regular monitoring and reporting on progress. This includes monitoring visits to the project by World Vision New Zealand and the New Zealand Embassy in Hanoi.
The project is due to end in May 2020. Future funding is dependent on how much progress is made, how much benefit Mrs. Bick and her neighbours get for nearly $3 million.
I want to go and explore the big cities in Vietnam, but because I'm so poor, I have no money to travel to outside places, so I just stay here.
A simple goal, just to leave her village for the first time in almost 4 decades. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
And Zach, who shot that story himself as well as reporting it, travelled to Vietnam courtesy of the Asia New Zealand Foundation. Next week we'll have his third story from that trip about New Zealand's merino exports. That's on Checkpoint next week. Farmers are hoping a trial to rid part of the Banks Peninsula of feral goats will finally get rid of the pest. Feral goats have been plaguing the peninsula for decades, causing a big headache for farmers who've had their fences ruined, stocks scattered, plants devastated, trees killed, you name it, all the stuff goats do. About 70 feral goats have been shot near Little Akaroa as part of a DOC trial, finally to get rid of them. But given goats are smart animals, it turns out they can be a real, bugger really to get rid of. Here's Logan Church.
Cam Stevenson is on the hunt as he walks through the bush and clouds high above Banks Peninsula. He and his faithful border collie, Pig, are part of a hit team of professional hunters tasked with cleansing the area of feral goats.
Usually you'll only see a piece of the animal, you might see a leg or an ear or a bit of back or anything like that, so you're basically waiting and for a good position to get a kill shot. So and trying not to let them know that you're there, obviously. So sometimes you can be standing there watching a piece of the animal, you know, for what seems like ever, but you know, 5 or 10 minutes before you actually get your shot.
And when a goat is shot?
Basically you want to get it out of sight. You don't want anyone finding your dead animals around or smelling them or things like that. Also you got to think about the farmers, you know, without their support we wouldn't be able to do our job in the first place, so we've got to look after them, and in the summertime with all the fly, they don't like dead animals lying around.
Feral goats have been a problem on the peninsula for decades, and the full extent of the infestation isn't known. However, now the Department of Conservation is trying to eradicate them once and for all. A muster earlier this year removed 220 goats from the area, and these professional hunters were brought in a few weeks ago to finish the remainder off in this part of Banks Peninsula, near Little Akaloa. So far they have shot about 70, and are hoping to wrap up their work this week. Armed with their rifles and their dogs, all trained and fitted with GPS, the team has been braving the cold, systematically and methodically hiking over and over the land to make sure every last goat is shot.
Obviously the weather isn't nice when you're cold and wet all day, every day. You got steep terrain to deal with. But I guess you forget about all that when you get onto an animal and start stalking it with your dog. You sort of forget about all that stuff.
But why are feral goats such a problem? Gavin, a sheep and beef farmer near Little Akaloa, says they can cause chaos on the farm.
In the areas where there is very limited fencing and some of the harder bush and gullies where we sort of rely on natural fencing a bit, the goats push in there and they make tracks and then the sheep follow them, and then you've got a major job trying to keep them out of there. Or yeah, that's a big issue. The other thing is that, you know, when the numbers mount up like they have done, there's, you know, as I said before, there's 280 odd goats that are sort of spending about sort of 60 to 65% of their time in our place. It's quite a bit of grass they're eating.
DOC's Christchurch operations manager, Andy Thompson, has been overseeing this operation, which has cost more than $80,000. He says a lot of work has gone into ensuring it's done as humanely as possible.
Doing an eradication is always involves an element of, you know, having to shoot animals, and that's never a pleasant part of the operation. That's why we chose to do a muster for the first initial knockdown. Farmers were concerned. They didn't want to see a bloodbath on their property. They wanted to know that the goats were being used for something.
It'll be at least a few months before DOC knows if this hunt has been successful. And the measure of that success is simple: no goats seen by anyone. Then next year, it will be on to the next hunt in another part of the peninsula.
We've got goats in 5 key locations on the peninsula. Hopefully we're down to 4 now. And so our planning will start straight away. We'll debrief from this operation, look at what we've learned from this operation, and then we'll put that into planning where we're going to operate next year.
As long as there aren't any unexpected surprises, DOC is hoping the entire Banks Peninsula can be feral goat free in 5 years. On the Banks Peninsula for Checkpoint, call Logan Church tēnei.
And Logan shot that story himself. What brilliant young people we employ. Right, just before we go, could a public holiday for Matariki soon be written to the stars and into law? A proposal to make Matariki a national holiday is being weighed up by the Labour Party's Māori caucus. And if the bill gains widespread support within the party, it could be introduced as a private member's bill. To Manukōrehi reporter John Boynton with the story.
If you look out into the night sky from tonight, the 9 stars of the Matariki constellation should be shining brightly. The celebration of Matariki, or the Māori New Year, has grown rapidly, with Wellington's Mayor Justin Lester recently calling for a Matariki public holiday to replace Queen's birthday. In 2009, a bill seeking to establish Matariki as a public holiday by former Māori Party MP Rahui Kātene failed to pass its first reading. So 10 years down the track, what's the likelihood of it happening? The chair of Labour's Māori caucus, Willie Jackson, says the issue was put on the agenda last week by Labour MP Paul Eagle.
There's general support for Matariki, absolutely, but whether it should be a public holiday or not is still being debated, but a lot of support for that.
However, the ramifications for employers, Mr Jackson says, plus the cost of making Matariki into a public holiday, need to be taken into account.
As I said, wearing my employment portfolio hat, the numbers might not stack up in that area, but that doesn't mean to say we can't celebrate Matariki still.
Green Party co-leader Marama Davidson says it's exciting to be considering Matariki as a holiday, and she wants to hear what the public thinks.
Matariki is ours because it celebrates the Māori mātauranga knowledge of the universe and of the cosmos. It talks about the stars and the seasons, and it talks about renewal and harvesting. So I think that it's a long time coming, actually.
One of the difficulties in setting up a public holiday, Ms Davidson says, will be locking in a day to hold it.
The first thing that struck me is, I wonder when, like what part of Matariki. Matariki is a season, and so, and is celebrated over sort of one to 2 months.
The Minister of Workplace Relations and Safety, Ian Lees-Galloway, has convened a Holiday Act task force. And he says a Matariki public holiday would be a good issue for them to consider. Mo te hōtaka o te ahi pōnei, ko John Boynton aho.
And John ends Checkpoint for the week. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Have a wonderful weekend. We'll be back Monday at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. A human rights lawyer says 2 Canadians accused of hate speech should be allowed to give the public talk, which has been cancelled after Auckland's mayor banned them from council venues. The difficulty of rescuing a young Thai football team trapped in a flooded cave system has been highlighted by the death of a diver who had been delivering oxygen tanks. Wellington City Council has postponed Saturday's Matariki Sky Show to avoid disturbing a whale that's taken up residence in the harbour. Rotorua Council is rushing through fire and building consent so people can sleep undisturbed at a homeless shelter. And Met Service is warning skiers, trampers and hunters that a storm brewing this weekend will increase the risk of avalanches. Our next news and weather is at 7.
This week on Music 101, we speak to Hamish Kilgour about his new album. We speak to the Bamboo.